Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this live stream 2 from the OROPEZA. The title of our session is Carbon Neutral Buildings, Waking the Sleeping Giant. EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen mentioned this sector earlier in her keynote speech this morning, and joining me now to take a closer look at this topic are Martina OTTO, head of the Cities Unit for the UN Environment Programme and head of the GlobalABC Secretariat, Marisol, OROPEZA, creator and coordinator of Heat Changers Initiative and business and marketing strategist for matters.mx, and ROSENBERG, senior vice president for sustainable development at Wood plc. Thank you all so very much for joining me this afternoon, and it's lovely to have you here. I would like to get things, though, started first with a question for our audience. When we discuss the energy transition today, we think primarily of electricity and mobility, but we rarely consider this sleeping giant in our title, the building sector. Our first question to you, audience members, and panelists, you're also welcome to take part in this poll, is a yes or no question. What challenges, actually this is an open-ended question, which challenges must be overcome in your country in order to wake the sleeping giant, the building sector? We will get those answers in, and we'll come back and look at those results in just a moment or two. But now I'd like to go to our panelists. We'll start with a statement from Martina OTTO on the GlobalABC Annual Status Report 2020. The floor is yours, Ms. OTTO.
Thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to be with you and tell you a little bit why we're talking about the sleeping giant. And that is with a few figures coming out of the Global Alliance for Buildings and Construction Global Status Report that was released only recently. It is that the buildings and construction sector is not on track for achieving the Paris Agreement climate goals. It has seen actually the highest CO2 emissions ever recorded, with around 10 gigatons CO2 from the operations of buildings. And once we add the 3.5 gigatons from buildings and construction, from the construction industry, for example, for our standard building materials with cement, steel, and glass, the sector's share increases to 38% of total global energy-related CO2 emissions. And that's something that's not negligible. And as you pointed out, we look often at energy and transport, but buildings is a big ticket item. What is interesting to note is that while we saw emissions rise, the total final energy consumption of the global building sector actually remains stable. And that shows us that there is a little bit of decoupling of emissions from the additional floor space that is kicking in. The CO2 increase is due to a continued use of coal, oil, and natural gas for heating and cooking, combined with higher activity levels in regions where electricity remains carbon intensive. So to state the obvious, the electrification trend is not solving everything, and it's necessary to look behind the doors of the electrification as well. And on top of that comes the projected doubling of floor space by 2060, or in other words, the addition of floor space of a Paris every week. And that means that obviously our construction materials, and with that, the embodied carbon is set to rise. And that means that we do need a triple strategy to drive down both energy demand and emissions. And that means we need to drastically reduce energy demand in buildings. We need to implement material strategies that reduce life cycle carbon emissions, and we need to decarbonize the power sector. And maybe one more set of trends that's coming from the finance side. Between last year and this year, we did see an increase of the incremental investments in building energy efficiency of 3%. But of course, at $152 billion against $5.8 trillion spent on buildings and construction, this is small and way too small. And but at the same time, the finance institutions and property developers have started to recognize the market of energy efficient buildings. And for example, green mortgages and green bonds are also on the rise. And another sign of hope to talk about, the giant waking up, is that the private sector companies have started to use science-based targets as well. This methodology to make zero carbon commitments. And what it comes down to is We know what to do and we can do it, even with existing technologies, but we actually need to scale up and to increase the pace as well. We have two key opportunities this year. One is, and that's sort of, if ever you can talk about the silver lining of COVID-19, of the pandemic, but it does provide an opportunity to build back better, literally. And the construction sector has a real critical role with higher than most sectors job creation potential. And here the renovation wave needs to kick in. So that's a real opportunity to set us a bit better on track. And the other one is the nationally determined contributions that are not to be missed. And I'm coming to the end, because only a share of countries have actually recognized the buildings in this. But there is such a huge opportunity. And well, as we go to Glasgow, we need to actually use them. And it's really time to wake up the sleeping giant. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Otto. Why don't we go now to Marisol OROPEZA, who has a statement about solar thermal applications and integration with other renewables. Ms. OROPEZA?
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here and to have this wonderful panel. Yes, indeed. It's a challenging thing to do for decarbonizing our world, because buildings have different size, architecture, insulation, geographical location, also a physical location where actually the building is placed. What type of energy supply does it have? What are the patterns of consumption, also according to region or to country? It varies a lot. So for us, I think it would be wise to think first, as Martina just mentioned, energy performance of building has to be improved. We have to make buildings as efficient as possible. And for this, there are plenty of options. I think there is a lot of awareness about energy efficiency for buildings, talking about smart buildings, including smart cities. How do we do this? Very good. But this depends also a lot on the region. It's different what Europe has been doing compared to what Mexico is doing, for instance. There are also different political backgrounds and policy aspects which have worked in some countries better than in others. So I guess first we have to learn from each other that energy efficiency first works, of course, also because it's a matter of investment. Why do we need to waste energy? Why do we need to pay for wasted energy? So I guess this is one of the messages that we need to spread a bit stronger, because it's also an investment and an opportunity for property owners to reduce their cost and increase the value of their property. On the other side, or secondly, we need to upgrade the buildings with energy produced on site from renewable sources, which are not contaminated or which are having a carbon footprint much lower than the current energy source. And for this, I agree, there are plenty of technologies available in the market which are very cost effective, ranging from different types of renewable sources, beginning with solar thermal, which is the infinite resource that we have, which costs nothing. We need to invest in the technology. But for these, there are different options around the world which cover different needs, because here we're talking about hot water, space heating, and cooling. And for all these purposes, there are different technologies which are very suitable, also according to the location of the building or of the energy patterns, consumption patterns. We have also biomass, which is, of course, a renewable energy source with a power to be combined also, for instance, with solar thermal. We have heat pumps, which is also a very good combination, very popular in Europe, for instance, using thermal energy, solar thermal energy in combination with heat pumps. And here we can also think of power coming from renewable sources like PV, for instance. But then there is also geothermal, very traditional in some countries, and also very important in Europe and growing now, district heating networks. District heating and cooling networks are a great chance to reach, of course, more people. It's much easier to supply heat through clean heat through the existing networks than convincing individual property owners to upgrade their buildings with any renewable energy source. So here, I guess that the option that all these renewable energy technologies give us is that they can make our decision more flexible in terms of what kind of technology are we going to use, which combination, But the key factor is to know what's the maximal use of renewable energy? What combination gives us the best? What combination help us to have an optimal reduction of CO2? And also with the least infrastructure, meaning also space available, and well, the investment, depending on the type of technology and the size of the systems, we are talking about high or medium or relatively low investment cost. And of course, the current energy supply and the prices make the renewables more competitive or less. So here we also need to think about the political aspect, the policy support, the subsidies that are being reduced also in some countries to the fossil fuels, making more competitive the use of renewable heating and cooling technologies. And last but not least, we need to think of also the increase that all this use of technologies give us in terms of energy security. You have seen, or perhaps you have been aware of the fact of these climatic conditions. It's not only that, okay, fossil fuels are high carbonized, but we also have very climatic conditions which are affecting energy supply. Recently, there was this snow problem in Texas, which affected the gas supply to Mexico, for instance. So Mexico is depending on gas imports from the United States, and there were huge problems because we couldn't have access. So many of the cities couldn't have access to gas. So we need to increase the on-site generation of energy from renewable sources at a cost-effective price, but also wisely thinking that increases the energy independence and also the quality of the energy that we are becoming. So from my side, as a solar thermal fellow, I would like to see more solar district heating networks. I'd like to see more combination of solar thermal with heat pumps, not only in Europe, which is the main market, but also abroad. And of course, in cities or in countries where the solar radiation is extremely good, and the heating demand is much larger than in other, much easier to meet with renewable energy sources. Solar thermal is, of course, one of the best technologies available. And last but not least, just to finish my statement, I'd like to raise the issue about awareness from the consumer side. We have seen now more interaction between the Internet of Things and renewable energy technologies. So I guess that this is a very good chance to get to the consumers and to make them aware of the fact of how much energy they can stop consuming with energy efficiency measures and how much green energy they can get from renewable sources. And for this, we need to be there in the Internet of Things. We need to put a face of the renewables, because visualizing performance is excellent. Visualizing consumption is something that we don't used to do. We just live and use our things, but we are not really aware of what we consume as people living in these buildings or using these buildings. So these are my key messages, and that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ms. OROPEZA. And now I'd like to go to Anne Rosenberg, and I believe you'll be talking about sustainable development.
Thank you so much. Yeah, absolutely. So I work for a company called Wood PLC. I recently joined from SAP, so I have a 20 years technology background. I couldn't agree more what was already mentioned by the earlier speakers, that technology play a really key role for really building a sustainable infrastructure. I recently launched, together with UN Global Compact, the SDG Ambition, and together with Antonio, the General Secretary. And the SDG Ambition is a translation of the 17 global goals into the private sector. And when we look at the building sector and across the whole heating and the opportunity we have to really build a solid, sustainable infrastructure, there are two ambitions that I want to mention here that we are seeing more and more companies in the private sector coming together around. This is the one called 100% sustainable material input that are renewable, recycling, or reusable. So what does that mean when you say that? It actually means a lot. It actually says that from you designing a building to identifying material for the building to really build the whole thing around this actually need to be rethought, rethinked. Just thinking about recycling, we're not just talking about recycling a portion, but recycling everything. We are talking about the material of the what you use when you build a building need to be rethinked about. So we talk about huge changes, and it can seem when we talk about a big shift in this sector. This is not the only sector that is being shifting right now. Every single industry is being shifted. So this is one ambition that I want to mention. The second ambition is the ambition around science-based emission reduction in the line with 1.5, where you can say when we build buildings and when we set up heating systems, that sector, as any other sector, also needs to go in jointly in a united way to contribute to work on making sure we don't increase more than the 1.5 and less over time. So the work that we do at Wood with is companies with is in 6 countries around the world. We really help to build up sustainable infrastructure. And what is exciting for me for what we see right now, because a lot needs to be done, is to see the role of technology. The role of technology, even though there's a lot of great technology solutions out there today, one thing is to have a great idea and a technology solutions within clean tech, but we also need to make sure that we get them integrated into the way we build heating systems. And some of the excitement that I'm seeing right now is the whole startup ecosystem that I also know that Berlin is very known for, but we have great startup ecosystem all over the world. On Clubhouse, there's a lot of conversation going on right now about the startup movement and green tech in Europe, contra United States, and there's no doubt about it. The United States is accelerating now based on that US is back into the Paris Agreement. And the fact that I'm Danish, the most green countries in the world, and I live in the United States, I have this incredible perspective about what we can do when we work together in a united way. But I think what is very important, because this is not going to be easy, and because we talk about shifting business model, we talk about shifting in the way we build, we talk about public-private partnerships, we talk about that technology will play a much bigger role than they've ever been building before. And I always think about, and it was mentioned also before, that it's not that building buildings and building smart cities is a new thing, because we've been working with smart cities and the concept of smart cities. But I always think about how smart were we really when we built smart cities, because we left the most important thing out of it, and that was the sustainability. And not just sustainability, but the resilience. And this is what post-COVID, you can say one thing that COVID have learned all of us is that you can't build anything if you don't put resilience into the conversation. So we need to make sure when we build the new kind of buildings and heating systems, and that we take into consideration the ambitions that I just mentioned for Euro Global Compact, but we also build it in a way that it is resilient, because now with COVID is the health crisis, we have the climate issue, but there are many more things that need to be solved going forward. And you can say, well, we really prepared? No, we were not prepared. We thought we were prepared. We thought about everything, because a smart city is not a new concept. It's been existing for a number of years. So I can say on behalf of Wood, we see an exciting time. Wood has incredible engineers around energy transition, digital technology, sustainable infrastructure. And we are going to see a world in front of us where a lot of new things need to be created, but we can only do it if we do it in a united way. And that's why I always shout out UN, because I think what UN is doing to the world by uniting us and understanding that one thing is to build and create solutions. If you live in Europe, you live in the United States, but what if you live in other part of the world where building and infrastructures are very different? So we need to make sure what we do is a sustainable approach that can be used all over the world. And that is what I always look at UN, because that is what the mandate. So when we talk about build back better, which was mentioned before, it's not just building back better in one society, it's building back better in every single society around the world.
Those are wonderful words. Thank you so much, Ms. Rosenberg. I want to go to the results of our audience poll. As a reminder, that question was, what challenges must be overcome in your country in order to, and I'll use the term again, wake the sleeping giant? Let's take a look and see what we have. We have the biggest one is increased renovation rate. women of the panel, I'll ask you to incorporate that idea into the next question I have. I'd like to address it first to Martina Otto, and then we can open it up to everyone. Should obligations for renewable energy sources in heating and cooling apply in order to do just this, to wake this giant? Ms. Otto?
Well, I think, one thing to say is heating and cooling obviously accounts for a huge share of the energy consumption in buildings. So that's why it's very good and very important to put a lot of emphasis on that. And obviously there's different ways how we go about that. And I alluded to that, and we heard a little bit more already in terms of, if it's provided with electricity, then look at what is behind it, how the electricity is being used. What are the other alternatives? Looking at, for example, the district heating and cooling was mentioned as well, which is really good, which looks beyond the single building, but at a neighborhood and connected solutions. And then looking beyond that, how we build, and actually, obviously renovation is super critical in this, where most of the buildings are built. And here I want to maybe differentiate a little bit, and you got a result that's maybe linked to as well where the audience does come from. There are differences, and Marisol mentioned that already a little bit. There are differences from one region to the other, from one country to the other, and obviously within countries as well. But what is important to keep in mind is we need a dual strategy. We need to improve. It's not either or, but we need to renovate existing buildings with a deep renovation. And I think that's absolutely critical. And there are a few tools to help us unlock that. For example, just as a keyword, building passports that help us keep track of what goes into a building and when critical stages of renovation are taking place. And if we turn that into something that helps create the value or maintain the value of buildings, then maybe we have more of an economic story behind that as well. And the other one really is also what happens with the new build. And it's not only about the heating and the cooling, but it's also about the materials. I made this case at the beginning, and we heard a bit about, well, different alternative building materials with wood. But if we look at some of the numbers, if we look to Africa, for example, the cement production is expected to more than triple, and steel production more than sixfold increases. So this is huge, and that's obviously not the only region where this is going to happen. So if we don't look also at the materials at the same time and at the new build, we are missing out on an opportunity. And if we know that, and one key point to actually get to this level is looking at the building codes. And if we know that only 73 countries in the world do have a building code, and if we know as well that 2/3 of the countries where most of the new build will actually happen, then we really have an issue here that we need to address. So looking at heating and cooling is important, but not only from, taking the service side, but looking really at how can we redesign our buildings to reduce the demand for heating cooling in the first place. So passive solutions and so on is really critical in going forward, and maybe to also look at nature-based solutions, particularly if you look towards the cooling side, which is a huge topic that's coming up. We've just heard about the health impacts with regard to COVID. Well, the health impacts from the heat waves are enormous, and we need to actually build the resilience right now, both in terms of the renovation, but also in terms of the new build.
Thank you very much.
For the time being.
Thank you very much, Ms. Otto. You mentioned renovations, and that leads me to my next question, which is for Marisol OROPEZA. In your experience with the German Heat Changers campaign, what incentives do homeowners need to then make significant improvements in terms of cost in the efficiency of their homes, or to switch their heating system to something with renewable energy?
Yeah, first of all, is the lack of awareness, what we need to tackle, because people are not really aware of what they consume for heat. What are the costs? Many people think about electricity, and when when you ask them how much do you spend on gas, for instance, which is typical, for instance, here in Mexico, say, oh, well, I don't know, I have to think a little bit. So it's, first of all, raising awareness, and this is what I mentioned before, the Internet of Things can help us to put this issue in the daily routine of people. How can they visualize it and be conscious about what they are using as an energy source? And the same happens for the industry, for instance. When you buy a product, you think the product's already organic and has a very nice package, but how was it produced is something that no really cares about. The second thing is cost. For me, it's always a cost issue. Not only the environmental cost, which is very difficult to show or to know or to understand, but if we could have a fair competition with fossil fuels, then renewables would be much more competitive and people would make an informed decision, but also a very conscious decision. And there would be really an option. Do I want to continue using fossil fuels or do I want to go for the green option? Whatever it is, if it's solar thermal or if it's heat pumps or if it's any other renewable source. But as long as fossil fuels are still subsidized or have a more competitive price, economical price, not environmental price, people are not going to understand. And solar obligations are a good thing. It has worked in many countries. It has worked in Israel, for instance, for solar thermal. It's one of the countries with the largest penetration rate per capita. It has worked in countries like Spain and at the city level, for instance, also in Mexico for new build. It's a must. However, people always think of cost. And I think it's the most important issue right now. Environmental awareness is raising thanks to, we need to say it like this, thanks to all these bad things which are happening with COVID or with climate change. However, it's still not the main reason to make a purchase decision. It's always cost. Cost for investors, cost for single home owners, cost for people living in a small building. How much does it cost? Not only investment costs and long-term costs. And as long as fossil fuels are still being subsidized, supported, the competition is going to be very hard. So that would be my guess for the question.
Thank you very much, Ms. OROPEZA. And Rosenberg, I'll have a question for you, but first I have another question for our audience. Get ready to answer another question on Slido. Do you believe that the topic of climate neutral buildings has a high priority in your country when it comes to climate protection? And we'll check in just before the end of our panel with your audience responses. For right now, we're already getting a few in, no. But so why don't we go to Anne Rosenberg? Ms. Rosenberg, what are your thoughts? How do we change people's mindset when it comes to buildings?
I actually love that you asked that question because I was just thinking about what was said just previous. I think it's all about education and understanding and about responsibility. Because often we take things for given, and I think it has the same thing when we turn on the light or when we go into a building. How much do we actually think about how in the material and how this whole thing has been put together? But what if we begin to think about it? What if we begin to take responsibility for our decision when we buy an apartment or buy a house or get a new rent? What if we begin to, just like we are changing our buying decision, that we decide now we take responsibility, we want to live a sustainable life. I think education and understanding, and I think that's something that COVID have shown us. I also think that when you build buildings, be accountable, responsible, share your data. There's a lot of project going on now that I think is super exciting across cities, where cities go in and together with building owners and schools and private people, and figuring out what is the net zero across the entire city, and you take a joint responsibility. I think if we all step up and take a role in this, because that's the only way you can change things. But it comes to one point that is transparency and education, and this is what data can give us today, but also conversations. And there was one thing I want to, what was mentioned before by Martina. This is about, if you look around renovation and material, I think this whole thing about understanding about recycling and reuse. And my concern is when she mentioned steel and she mentioned cement, because as we are seeing that the way of living is becoming better all around the world, and think more things is going to be built and the materials is going to be used. If we don't begin to change the understanding about using cement, using steel, how you build, how you use heating systems, but if you just continue to repeat what we have done for years, we're not going to change things. It's kind of funny thing, like it's about changing the new normality. We need to create a new normality within the building sector. What is acceptable when you build a building? So we make sure that everything that's going to be built going forward is going to be built the right way. And that go back to, you asked the question before about, I call it the regulations. I think it's time to put in regulation responsibility. And that's, again, going back to UN, about setting up strong ambitions and then be accountable for those ambitions in a united way. So I think education, regulations, transparency, and then simple build a new standard for how you build and use heat, and make sure that that is going to be adopted all over the world. And not to forget affordable, right? It needs to be affordable. So I know we are shifting a huge industry here, but it can't be at the price that the price goes up, because then it will not be possible, right? So that's something we need to take into account. And of course, it's a big ask, because we need to come up with technology solutions. We need to come up with solutions that is affordable all over the world. But this is also a learning that we all are getting right now, going through COVID. If you look at the pharmaceutical industry, around getting access to vaccine, getting access equally to that. No, it's going to be exciting, but it's a huge shift. But I believe we can do it because we need to. Yeah.
I like that you say that. I believe we can do it because we need to. I want to check in with our audience poll quickly, and then I have a final thought for Ms. OTTO. Why don't we go ahead and bring up the results from our Slido? Do you believe that the topic of climate neutral building has a high priority in your country when it comes to climate protection? 63% of you say no, 37% of you say yes. I see what's lovely here for our audience at home. I have our three panelists here on the screen in front of me, and it's been such a pleasure to watch you nod in agreement, and it's been wonderful to get to see your faces today. Ms. OTTO, I'd like to ask you the same question that I just posed to Ms. Rosenberg before we close out this panel. How do you change people's mindset when it comes to buildings?
Well, I think we heard quite a bit of that already. And well, people, we have to unpack a little bit as well. It's who lives in a building, who owns a building, and it's also all the people who are working on making buildings happen. So it's not entire workforce as well. And I think it's what we keep saying is about radical collaboration across the entire value chain, so that whatever is proposed, it's already slightly different or radically different. But that there is much better cooperation and coordination between the different professions in the sector. Sometimes solutions are proposed at a too later stage to factor into the conception and so on. So that's a key one. If we look at materials, I think it's important to what Anne said in terms of changing some of the norms and factoring in culture as well. Not everything has been created since the dawn of time with cement and steel. It has become the modern way of doing things. It does. But there's maybe a way to think about what was good before and modernize that as well. So look at alternative building materials in a very modern and innovative fashion. Bring that on board as well. It's about the transparency.
OTTO, for these final thoughts.
Critical.
And I'd like to thank all of our panelists so much.